So thanks a lot, Stephanie, for your time. Maybe I go straight to the point. I guess that sustainable investment already had a little bit of history. And I remember from my time, I started working in 2011, a hard time, and there was not much about sustainable finance. And I guess it all started around 2016, 2017, and all the trends were somehow related to climate change. So now my question will be, what do you think are some of the key trends in sustainable investment at the moment, and what are the investors looking at?
Great, thank you. Good to be with you. So yes, there are some pretty significant trends going on. I think you highlighted climate change, and certainly the Paris Agreement in 2015 is one of the sort of key points, I think, that really brought in finance into this big systemic risk and challenge that we have. And obviously from that came the task force on climate related financial disclosure, and really a much deeper appreciation of the interconnectedness between climate, financial systems, investment, etc. And I think that continues to be a really key trend. I think as we come up to 10 or so years from the Paris Agreement, this question about what does the transition look like is a really important one. And I think one of the challenges is it looks like it's going to be a disorderly transition, despite the fact that we've seen a lot of companies, private, public sector take action. When you look at the degrees of temperature rising, we're still not going in the right direction. And clearly there's a huge amount of complexity linked to that geopolitics, as well as the sort of technology policy elements as well. So I think the net zero transition continues to be a really driving theme from an investment perspective. I think the second one to highlight is really nature, and that nature interdependency with climate, but also nature risk, the challenges around nature degradation, and the impact that also has on GDP as well. So I think certainly in the last few years, following the Montreal Kunming COP around biodiversity and the target setting there, we're seeing a lot more focus from investors on understanding the importance and the reliance on nature, and we're seeing some of that come through with some policy as well. And I think the final piece to highlight is really around the disclosure piece around sustainability more broadly. As there's a greater appreciation of the importance of these issues, like climate change, like nature, but also, social issues as well, and the role that private companies have, that the finance system has on influencing these, managing these, taking the opportunities, managing the risks, we're seeing disclosure requirements really step up, obviously in Europe particularly, but we're also seeing that in Asia, in other jurisdictions in Latin America, in even the US has, while there's a lot more challenge around some of that disclosure, we've seen disclosure step up there as well. So I think those are three key trends that will continue to shape the landscape going forward.
No, indeed. Thanks a lot, Stephanie. I do completely agree with you, especially on the last part on the disclosure, because I think that at least for us, when my time I was at the ECB and now here at Banco España in the Eurosystem, it is really key, the disclosure, because sometimes you see jumps in data. Also, what a green bond shows you, what are they doing? They avoided emissions, or avoided megawatts and all that. So I think that all this trend on disclosure it's really key and important for the investors to make like a smart decision when they invest, no, and also informed decisions, because sometimes when we see a green bond and we don't have all the disclosure, we say like, okay, what are we doing? How are we contributing? No, so I think this is key, and I also agree with the climate and now nature that it's coming as well. No, so in a sense, how do you think investors should be looking at the transition to net zero from their point of view? I don't know, how do you think they will integrate this in their portfolios, and how they should be thinking of it?
Yep. So I think the first thing is really to recognize what a sort of, I guess, mega trend this is and how wide ranging this is. It will require a huge reallocation of capital, but as we know in investing, how, where, when, where that's going to result in a good return versus a poor return is incredibly complex. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it is a huge opportunity, as well as a huge risk if we don't do it appropriately. So I think, to that extent, it is looking at the both the allocation towards the opportunities that we see in climate, new technologies, those solutions that are going to support the net zero transition, those companies that are themselves successfully setting themselves targets and seeing how they can actually find the opportunities from new markets, new products, but also we also need to recognize the risks as well. Engaging with companies is incredibly important, both to understand how well positioned they are, but also to encourage that that transition. We run a green bond fund as well, and the disclosure piece is key. We see a huge opportunity in the sort of use of proceeds and how we can allocate to those specific projects, but we are still engaging with those issuers on actually ensuring that we do have that sort of impact data, that we do understand how the real world impact that allocation is having. So I think it's a huge opportunity. You really need to understand both the transition risks and now increasingly the physical risks as well, the challenges around adaptation, resilience, as we're seeing the temperature continue to rise. And I think thinking about it holistically as well, the concept of a just transition, understanding the impact that companies transitioning has on the workforce, on the communities that they're operating in, is really, really, really key.
Yeah, I totally agree with this last part that you said as well. Like, do we really need to understand how companies are like trying to making a big effort to transition, and how they are doing things, and I think engaging is really important. I mean, us from a central value perspective, is really difficult for us for reputational risk to really engage, but I guess that it's one of the latest trends, no? These engaging with companies and all that, and I think that AI has also a big role here, not only in improving all the processes and technology, but also on the disclosure side, no? As you mentioned before, no? All these could be kind of improved with the introduction of AI. But maybe we just turn to the last question. You talk a lot about about private initiatives and also private investors, but how do you think the policy and regulation, what is the role of policy and regulation in the sustainable investment? And also, not only that, but also how do you see public institutions should be approaching all this sustainable investment trend?
Yeah, so absolutely, I think the regulation, regulatory policy framework is key, and we're seeing that both on the opportunity side. So if you look at something like the US Inflation Reduction Act, huge policy measure there, putting a lot of incentives behind developing lower carbon technologies. So there's a huge opportunity there, signaling that actually transitioning is an investment opportunity as well. I think if you look at some of the other sort of real economy policy measures, we're seeing a lot of as jurisdictions, as the EU, Japan starts translating their national targets into specific policy measures for their own decarbonisation, whether that's around planning, renewable infrastructure, industrial strategies. All of these things are absolutely shaping the environment within which the companies are operating, within which investors are investing. And I think it's actually becoming more critical, because we are coming to the point where we can see there is only so far that the private sector can go with within the current framework that we have. And so policy becomes more and more important, both to give the clarity if you're investing for a long time frame, but also to create some of those incentives towards the transitioning, and to unlock some of the bottlenecks. I mean, mentioned the sort of the planning and the infrastructure piece. Decarbonisation for a lot of companies relies on electrification and on the renewable, and that electricity grid being renewable. That is not something that a single, that a company can do by itself. That needs the government piece, and public bodies, public finance, as well as the private finance. So I think that's really key. The other bit is obviously the regulation, quite considerable regulation we've seen on sustainable finance, which again has anchored a lot around disclosure to understand what those products are when you're looking at how we are going back to the point around allocating capital, understanding and categorizing the types of investments, in part so we can sort of measure where that capital is going. So things like the taxonomies, obviously the EU taxonomy, but there's the sort of 30 plus taxonomies in different jurisdictions, sort of supporting that. So I think really understanding the interplay will become more and more important, and also investors engaging in the type of policy framework that is actually constructive to mitigate that long-term and systemic risk is increasingly important. So I think we'll see a lot more focus on that policy regulatory piece, because it is so necessary for the net zero transition.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks a lot, Stephanie. I do agree as well. But maybe if I may, one last question, because as you mentioned, all these, the private investors and also the companies transitioning. So basically, of course, the public bodies have a kind of responsibility to somehow incentivize all these investments. And somehow, I guess sometimes investors will by default invest in sustainable investment because if companies are transitioning. But I was going to tell you or ask you, sorry, how do you see this trend within private investors? I think that there was like a boom in 2018, 19, or maybe 2020 when all private investors were looking at or searching for all this sustainable investment. But does this trend still is the case? Are they asking for investing in this because they see this sustainable investment as a real opportunity that will give them profits, or have they just it was like a fashion that already has disinflated somehow? I don't know, because sometimes from our side as a public institution that we make investment in sustainable investments, we also ask ourselves, is the private sector doing the same? Because basically all these reports that come out that they say, okay, all these public funds are needed, but a lot of private funds are also needed. So basically, we will need that private part as well. So I don't know if investors are also willing to participate. How is their appetite right now? I don't know, from your point of view and your experience.
Yeah, so certainly, I think one of the challenges is that we've seen a lot of conversation around sustainable investment, but there's still not necessarily the same level of understanding around what would constitute a sustainable investment. And it is not one thing. You mentioned about investing in certain, in green bonds because there's a specific opportunity there. It can also be about just better managing environmental, social, and governance risks. For certain clients, it may be about avoiding allocating to certain areas. And I think what we've seen is really a recognition that, yes, sustainability issues are incredibly important to the investment process, but how you invest to ensure that you're delivering on the investment outcomes as well as the sustainability outcomes, is more complicated. And I think this is where we're seeing a focus or perhaps a shift away from just I don't want to invest in these types of activities to actually we're talking about a transition. That means gradual change. That means certain companies that may be or sectors. If you look at materials, cement is highly carbon intensive material, but also highly currently relied upon for building, for all the infrastructure for new homes that we need to build. So the question is not just how do I avoid carbon intensive companies in my portfolio. That's not actually having a real economy impact. It's around what are those companies that as an investor, we think are going to transition, are going to come up with the technologies, the development that will make them good investments in the future as well, still providing that product or service that provides the need ultimately, but in a way that's less carbon intensive as well. So I think there's been certainly a lot more. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm because of the big challenges, and now and I think does it make sense to invest sustainably? Yes. The question is, right, how? And that how is a huge sort of complex, but that's also where the opportunity is. There are lots of opportunities here, and it's really, that is the role of private finance, asset owners, asset managers, public finance to ensure that the structure is there to capital flows that delivers on the sustainability objectives where there are sustainability objectives, but also on the investment objectives. So I think we've seen and we'll continue to see a bit of a sort of maturation of that.
Yeah, no, I'm very glad to hear that all this enthusiasm has not cooled down, and that people are really thinking of ways of how to invest, because this is also the problem that we faced when we started to invest in, let's say, sustainable investment. How do we do? Do we do exclusions? Do we do a tilting? Do we do green bond fund dedicated? So yeah, I'm very glad that also from the private sector, people are questioning themselves how to do this and how to. So yeah. Thanks a million, Stephanie. I don't know. This is all from my side, and thanks a lot for your time.